Hello everyone, and welcome back again to this City Nature Challenge Nature Chat. If you're just catching up, over the bank holiday weekend, over 3,000 people in the UK were out snapping photos of nature on their steps and sending them in via the free iNaturalist for the International City Nature Challenge. And this year the challenge saw over 400 cities worldwide and 14 of those in the UK working together to really put wildlife on the map. And across the whole of the country, you've collected over 54,000 wildlife observations for citizen science over the weekend, and those numbers are still going up. The chance to take photos in the field is actually over, but we have a few days left to upload the photos that are left languishing in the SD cards of our phones, and picking out those extra sightings to get them up online through the iNaturalist app before the final global tally is announced on May the 10th. And so this afternoon, we've been encouraging people to get involved, have a go at helping out with processing some of those amazing records that have come in by logging into the iNaturalist app and helping to identify some of the species which are have been photographed and maybe been labelled as unknown or not quite, or just a family level for things as well. So get in there, have an explore of what people have found, and also helping us sort of pick out any highlights and some really cool stuff that we might have missed. Whilst we're doing that, we're going to be geeking out live on Facebook with some of the UK's top wildlife experts, asking for top tips on how to identify particular groups and just having a really nice chat as well. And so it's my pleasure for this one to welcome Imogen Cavadino as well from the Royal Horticultural Society, and we're going to be talking all things slimy with slugs and snails as well. So Imogen, who you start? I'll just introduce you, sort of say, do you want to say a little bit about who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. So I'm Imogen and I work for the Royal Horticultural Society, where I'm doing my PhD with Newcastle University and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is a bit of a mouthful. And my PhD is all focused around understanding slug and snail diversity in UK gardens. But also I'm on the council as well for the Conchological Society of Great Britain and Ireland, which is a society that exclusively studies molluscs. So that slug and snails, but also includes things like freshwater mollusks, so freshwater bivalves, freshwater snails, and also marine stuff as well. But my focus is very much on the terrestrial, so I love the sticky and the slimy slugs and snails that we found on the land.
It's amazing as well, because it's probably something that not everyone automatically associates is thinking of sort of slugs and snails necessarily as mollusks. Maybe it conjures a bit more of that kind of seaside rock pooling type imagery when you think of mollusks, but slugs and snails very much in that group.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting as well, because actually slugs and snails, the terrestrial ones, have evolved from their marine relatives, but this didn't just happen in one event. They actually did it several different times throughout millennia. So actually, there's some slug groups on the land that are more closely related potentially to some terrestrial snail groups than they are other slugs, just to do with the complicated way that things have evolved. Mollusks are actually one of the oldest phylum on the planet, so they're actually really fascinating animals, quite unique biology and ecology as well.
And what sort of has drawn you? Is this something that you've kind of fallen into as an area of research, or have you, like, were you the little girl picking up slugs and snails in the garden? Is it like something that's grown on you, or has this always been a passion?
I wish I could say that it's always been a passion, but actually it really hasn't. So I first started studying slugs and snails when I was doing my master's degree, because we had to do a module on taxonomy and identification, and I decided to pick a group of animals that I thought was absolutely horrific, that I should probably learn to appreciate. So actually that's how I ended up studying slugs to start with, because I was like, oh, they're truly disgusting, I should probably learn a little bit more about them and learn to appreciate them. And I just was gripped as soon as I picked up the FSC guide to slugs, started reading it. And the thing that stood out for me is they were talking about how slugs have to often create like a mucus rope to lower themselves from high objects. And this is because if they fall from high objects, they get concussion. And I just had I think in a way I'd never really thought of them as being almost living animals that could have that kind of thing. So I didn't realise that concussion was something that this group of animals could experience. So for me, I was just like, oh, wow.
Also, just makes you think Spider-Man would have been a very different film if it was a radioactive slug.
I'd love to see that film. Please say something.
Slug Man. Marvel, get on it.
Yeah.
We should probably trademark that now. So that's really interesting. They basically you sort of thought like, what's the most repulsive thing that I can go and study, and fell in love with it. I think that's amazing. That's a much better story than the kind of childhood sweetheart version as well.
I always do feel a bit fraudulent though when you meet those kind of people who said, "Yeah, I've been ever since I was tiny," and I'm there like, it was only probably about 8 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. But it just goes to show as well that sort of anyone who's there thinking like, oh, you know, slug stuff's not really my thing. When's the butterfly thing going to be on? Is that actually, no, that's not, butterflies, everyone knows butterflies. I pick on the butterflies and birds, actually. I just pick on them just because I like to wind people up. But, you know, the grotty and the slimy is where the interesting things are at, and is where the things where not a lot of other people are looking, I suppose, as well.
Yeah. So there is quite a long history of recording slugs and snails. It goes back a long way, actually, in the UK. But it has been very patchy because it tends to have just a handful of people who are really interested, who study it quite intensively. And it's not like birds where, you know, you've got hundreds of people who are instantly interested and start recording. It's a bit less accessible than that, I think, in a way, partly because there is that revulsion. So yeah, we always need more slug and snail records. They're really, really useful, and they're kind of quite an easy group to find, really, particularly in the UK with our nice wet climate. So you know, just going out in the garden, you'll probably see a load anyway, during the night time particularly. So they're really easy to find, but it's just actually getting some of the most common species recorded can be quite tricky. So actually we've got big patches of data missing, and that's really important over time, particularly because species that have been really, really common in the past are becoming less common now, and we're actually seeing also a lot more species arriving and establishing in Britain that are not native and could actually potentially be out competing some of our native species, or actually cause problems in terms of affecting our plants. So it's really, really important to actually record the common species for this group, I would say. So get out there and record your common slugs and snails that you see every day, because all those records are really helpful in actually understanding these big shifts that are happening around us.
I think we saw actually over the weekend when we had City Nature Challenge, particularly the Bank Holiday Monday, when for a lot of us in the UK, the weather took a bit of a nosedive. We actually saw a big surge in those slug records coming in, because it was what people could find in the rain as well. They weren't getting out and on as many walks and things. So, I mean, what would be your sort of top tips if we sort of say what if you're going out in your garden, what are you looking for?
You're looking for anywhere nice and damp and dark. So that is what slugs love, and snails as well. So generally looking under logs, that kind of thing is really good. But actually, you'll find often under man-made objects there'll be, so under things like plastic sacks as well, anything that traps the moisture and keeps it nice and damp, but also quite a nice dark environment, because most slug species are quite nocturnal, so they'll tend to only really be active at night, though there are some that will venture out in the daytime after rain, so you will actually see those in the daytime. So during the day, if you're looking for most species, it tends to be look under objects because they'll be at rest during that time, and that's probably the best way to find them.
And what kind of species are people going to be finding? Maybe if they're looking in parks or gardens, or this maybe what are the kind of, what would be the most likely species that people will encounter, and how would they tell the difference for some of those maybe?
Oh, so that is quite a complicated question to answer, and that's partly what all of my PhDs actually. So we know historically which are probably the most common species in gardens, but the most kind of the most intensive study was done in the 1940s. So obviously since then things have changed dramatically. So we have an idea of what could be the most common now, but part of my research at the moment is actually I've got 60 people all around the UK gathering this data for me and going out once a month and finding out what slugs are there. So hopefully in a year's time I'll have a much more precise answer for you. But what I would say is you'll probably find one of at least 4 main groups. So we have like the long-keeled slugs, we call them, which tend to be mostly underground, but they often do appear above the surface. We have the short-keeled slugs, which is a huge family of slugs. So things like the charismatic leopard slug are in that. And then we have the round-back slugs, which have this kind of characteristic mucus pore at the tip of the tail. So they're kind of those big chunky ones you probably see around a lot with kind of the orange skirt around the edge. So they're quite common. There's actually around about 5 species of those, and it's a bit complicated because they like to hybridize as well. So it's a bit of a nightmare actually. So although they're some of the commonest slugs to find, they're actually one of the hardest group of slugs to identify. Which does make it a bit challenging. So you might notice that if you have submitted records to City Nature Challenge, you might have some of your records downgraded from being a species to being a species aggregate, because iNaturalist does love to try and be optimistic and try and identify those slugs to species, and often it takes the taxonomic expertise coming in afterwards, and people who are familiar with slugs looking at it and going, oh sorry, no, we can't quite see enough of that slug to be sure it's not one of the other species. So please don't be disheartened if you have submitted a slug record of those big chunky slugs with the orange foot edge around the foot, because yeah, they are really difficult. So don't be disheartened if it does get downgraded to, say, a genus. Sorry.
And that actually throws up a question that came up in one of our other chats as well, was around if people are taking photos of slugs, particularly for identification, because quite often particularly when we're doing City Nature Challenge and there's a bit of speed involved, we'll take one very quick photo and then move on as well. It's thinking about to make it easier for that online community to help identify things. How many different angles does a slug have?
Yeah, we always want 3. 3 is the perfect combination. But yes, so we always want a top-down view. So if your slug is crawling or if it's contracted, we want to kind of see, looking at it from the top essentially, because that way we can see the different patterns on the body. And then we always want a right-hand side view. I know it's ridiculous saying hands when slugs don't have them, but hopefully you understand what I mean. And that's because actually slugs are completely asymmetrical. So they're very, very weird animals in that most of the body organs are on the right-hand side of the body. And that includes the breathing pore, which is the opening on the right-hand side of the slug, which opens and closes as they breathe. And sometimes the colour around that is quite important for identification, which is why we always want that right-hand side view. And then ideally, we want an underside view as well. So you kind of turn your slug over so that we can see the sole of the foot. If you have a piece of plastic or glass lying around, or you're carrying something like that with you, ideally get them to crawl on it, turn it over and take a photo. But if you're in the field, you probably don't have those things, just kind of flip it over and try and get a quick picture, because the colour of the sole of the foot can also be really helpful in trying to identify to species level. So yeah, 3 main views: top, side, underneath.
Amazing. I think, that's something that has been a recurring theme as well for sort of helping to get those things from photos. And in terms of that, I'd like to pick up the question as well from in the chat from Molly. And again, if you do have any questions, do just drop them in the Facebook chat and we'll be able to see them. Is about the cellar slug survey, which is surprisingly difficult to say.
It's a good time.
Tell us a bit about cellar slugs.
Yeah, so this is one of the surveys I'm running as part of my PhD. So this is to do with 2 species of slug known as the cellar slug. They're both quite beautiful slugs, I have to say, in that they have this green or yellow mottled pattern, a bit like camouflage, a bit like the military wear. So it's quite beautiful, and bluish tentacles. But what's quite interesting about these is there's two species that do look quite similar, but actually they're completely separate species. One has been here since at least the 1600s, maybe earlier. There's a bit of debate as to whether it could be native or not. The other one actually only arrived here in about the 1950s, or maybe a little bit before that. But interestingly, the green cellar slug, which is the more recent arrival, is spread really rapidly throughout our natural environments and also our gardens, and seems to be replacing the yellow species. So what we've been trying to do is just get people out there, look for these two species, take a photo when they see it, and send us the records so that we know where these species are. What we're finding so far over the past year or two is that actually the green cellar slug is absolutely everywhere, and there's only a handful of records of the yellow cellar slug, so there's very few of them around. So yeah, get out there, get involved. I will be looking through all the records that come in through the iNaturalist as well, to try and see if we've got any extra ones on there that can be the yellow cellar slug. But it does seem to be becoming increasingly rare, so do keep an eye out for those. And the nice thing as well about these slugs is they actually are detritivores, so they don't damage live plants, so they're actually quite a nice slug to have around.
And that's quite an important point, isn't it? I suppose because there's such a kind of association, isn't there, for gardeners and things of slugs, and that not all slugs are created equal. In a maybe they all get tarred with the same brush from a gardener's perspective, but lots of different ways of living, I suppose, for them.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah, and it's very much that concept of, most gardeners look at a slug and assume the worst, but actually there's a huge amount of variation. So there's some slugs that are very specialist in their diets. So for example, there's actually a group of slugs known as the shelled slugs, and these have a little shell that they carry around on the tip of the tail. They live completely below the surface of the soil, where they feed on earthworms. So those do no damage to plants at all, and in fact they feed on such a small amount of earthworms they probably don't do any damage to earthworm populations either, so they're completely harmless to us as gardeners, if you are a gardener. There's also some very specialist species that live in ancient woodland, some that just feed on fungi, as well as a whole range of species that are kind of omnivorous. So that means they pretty much will eat anything. So that includes things like our plants, but also things like rotting dead animals, animal poo. Dog poo seems to be a favourite for those big black slugs that I was talking about earlier with the orange fringe. They seem to love dog poo for some reason, which is really important because it helps break those things down in the environment and just recycle the nutrients back into the soil. So although slugs get a bit of a bad press and some of them will damage plants, actually it's a lot more complicated than that.
Amazing, and also it's an area where there's not enough areas where you can discuss and sort of say, and the ones with the blue tentacles. That sentence is not said enough in any of these conversations. I suppose there's we talked quite a lot about the data and that you're doing a lot of work with specifically with some of these different species, but as well as kind of feeding into your PhD, which I'm sure is a massively worthy cause for people to be putting these records in as well. But think about how in practical terms as well, how environmental data is helping to inform how we work with these species, how we look after this sort of diversity, and how we think about slugs going forwards. What role do you see for this kind of data and knowledge to feed into that?
Well, so most of
That's
the data.
That's a big question, I think.
Yeah, it's a big question. So all the data that I receive from my project all feeds into the Horticultural Society's data set as well, and that has a wide range of uses. So it's often used to inform things like habitat conservation for a particular site, particularly if it has a rare species of slug or snail on it, but also just in understanding biodiversity in general and the impact that human behaviour is having on those species. So one of the things that we're also quite interested in the RHS is kind of promoting more tolerance of slugs in the garden. So using these records and the associated information that we can find on their diet and things like that to kind of evidence when beneficial species might be most abundant, and also when less helpful species might be most abundant, and trying to kind of look at when control in the garden may or may not be appropriate. So I know we're very much trying to move away from the idea that, you reach for the molluscicides as soon as slugs appear, and be more kind of understanding and understand the nuances and the differences in the fauna. But there is so much scope for all these records as well. So it's not just in that context, but in helping to understand where invasive species are, where they're arriving, where they're coming from, is really important, because we are in this huge period of change. Over the past sort of 80 years or so, we've seen more and more slug species arriving and establishing, and our fauna changing. We don't really know what impact that has on the environment at this point. It's not really being very well studied, so we can't really say for sure. But we do know that this change is going to continue, particularly with things like climate change happening. So you might see some species moving further north, and you might see other species arriving from more exotic areas and establishing as well. And some of those species have further reaching consequences than damaging plants. It's very unlikely, thankfully, that our climate will get affected enough to maybe get to the level where some of those different more problematic species might arrive, but they can actually carry parasites that can affect humans as well. So we do need to keep an eye out for these changes to see if those species do start arriving, and if we do need to start considering whether those parasites might come with them or not as well. So there's a huge amount of scope for these records and what they can actually tell us, and in understanding how this change is happening around us.
That's amazing that there's so many as well. I mean, do we know how these different species are arriving in the UK?
We don't really monitor it that well, I'm afraid. But they do a lot of work on it in the US, which is really interesting. So we have a lot of data from the USA, because they actually have a national malacologist whose job it is just to answer that question of what's coming in from where on imports and on what type of import. So I actually was lucky enough to go out, fly out a couple of years ago and meet up with the team there. And it was so interesting because they were talking about how the obvious pathways is, of course, things like the plant trade. You'll probably get some slugs hitchhiking in soil or in plants because they're really good at that. But also completely unexpected things like military equipment returning from overseas. They'd often find snails attached to that, and things like shipping containers. So they were showing me a list of records of snails and where they'd come from, and I was saying, I'm particularly interested in seeing what we've exported from the UK to you. And we're looking through the list, and I was like, what is that snail species? That's definitely not a British one. And it was a Mexican snail. And what they were saying is actually happened was it had been detected when it came from the UK to the US on the container, but actually that container probably came from Mexico in the first place. So the snail was just incredibly well travelled if that had gone from Mexico to the UK to the US, and it had only been picked up in the US. So they're just such amazing hitchhikers because they have the advantage over, say, other insects or insect groups, because they are not necessarily reliant on one host plant. They can just be adaptable. So they can hitchhike on a man-made object and be perfectly fine without having to have particular food available to them. So they are really opportunistic in that way. They can spread pretty well. But yeah, it's a big question, and is trying to understand how they're getting here.
Amazing. I suppose then it's kind of a question of how easy some of those things might be to identify, but then the records become really vital as well for sort of tracking that progress of where things are going as well. Because especially if we don't have that same kind of entry point checking that you were describing for the US, that actually we're even more reliant on those things just being picked up when they're out there.
Definitely.
Found in the data.
Yeah, that's so true. So many times a new record of a species for the country is just through a chance encounter for a member of the public, or maybe a member of the society who's familiar with the fauna and notices something's different, and that's on the ground. So yeah, I've actually had that happen to me a couple of times where I found something new to Britain in the garden. and it's obviously been there a little while. It's just no one's been able to identify it yet.
I always think it's amazing with these groups that have relatively few experts, have relatively few people, amateurs looking for them as well. It's where you can find the amazing new discoveries for things. You're much likely to find an unusual or rare snail, probably just because, or slug, because nobody else has been looking for it. Whereas if you might find out about a bird or a butterfly, but actually, you've got that many, you're probably not the first person to see it. So it does pay to be interested in the things that not many other people are looking at, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely. And there's another really interesting example from slugs is that actually we found that, well, Ben Rosen found the ghost slug, which is quite a famous slug now. You might have heard of it. It's a white one that lives underground, feeds on earthworms. So that was first detected in Wales. It's now kind of spread towards Bristol, spreading throughout the rest of the UK now. We're getting more and more records from further afield. But actually, when that was found, it's brand new to science. No one had ever found it before. No one had described it before. It's a brand new species. But it's not from the UK. It's originally from the Ukraine region. So it's just a lovely example of, looking in your own garden, looking in your own back garden here, you could find a species brand new to science that is not actually native to the UK.
And is literally just on your doorstep as well.
Yeah.
I suppose for both thinking of the kind of recording, but also what people can do to support their local slugs. What can people do? How can people get involved in either in the kind of research end of things or kind of generally looking after their local maligned mollusks?
I think one of the best ways to get involved is just to start looking at them. So the Horticultural Society actually put on a range of field meetings throughout the spring, summer and autumn. They're open to members, but also open to non-members as well to come along and have a go. We're a really friendly bunch. It's a mixture of amateurs, of professionals as well, and we're all really keen, and we love when people are interested. So if you want to come along to one of the field meetings, check out the website. Come and join us and just start having a go, start having a look. And of course, iNaturalist, the AI is getting pretty good. So have a go, take some photos of slugs and snails when you find them and see if you can identify them as well. So any records help really. So just get out there, give it a go, see what you can find. And that's probably the best thing you can do for them at the moment. And of course, please do take a look in your garden for any cellar slugs and send them into my survey because that's really important for my data as well.
Absolutely. So number one call to action is look for cellar slugs and let Imogen know. We've got just a couple of minutes left. So I think it would be really interesting. I had a little moment before this call where I thought I need to look up to have like one really killer question. So I'll just Google slugs and see what comes up. And the first thing that came up was a reference to, I don't know if you've ever seen the kind of Aardman cartoon Flushed Away. Sort of DreamWorks where it's about a mouse that gets flushed down the toilet and ends up living in the sewer for it, and it's just got all of these amazing like screaming and singing slugs through it.
I've never seen it, but I've seen photos, like the pictures from it.
It's very well worth a watch. But do you get like gifts of like slug every time someone sees a slug thing? They like, I'm going to get that for Imogen as well. Do you like? Have slugs taken over your life and now everyone just thinks of you as the slug lady?
Not as much as I'd like, actually. There's not many slug items out there. They're not as pretty as snails, so actually it's hard to find slug-related objects. But yeah, I have been warned by a friend that when I get my PhD, I will be just referred to constantly as Dr. Slug or the slug lady.
You get like annoyed by any like cultural references as well. But pop culture references to slugs and when they get it wrong, or they put the breathing hole on the wrong side or something.
Yeah, well, it's quite a long-running joke within the Horticultural Society is spotting all the cartoon snails that are backwards. So So I was talking earlier about how slugs are asymmetrical, but also snails are as well. So the vast majority of snail shells and most species will coil to the right. So they always coil to the right. So whenever you see a cartoon snail and they put it coiling to the left, that's wrong. It's just one of those tiny things that just winds us up a little bit, but also makes us giggle.
Showing up in playgroups every so often, just critiquing 5-year-old stories. Just get sorry, that's the wrong way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that brilliant exploration into all things slimy. And we're approaching the time where we've got time for. But thank you so much, Imogen, for joining us for a little chat. And everybody, please do check out the UK DataBlitz Facebook page for the chats that we've already had this afternoon. There'll be a couple more coming up as well, and there's other great content there from City Nature Challenge. Do jump on the iNaturalist, have a go, use your newfound slug identifying skills to pick out some of those slugs, or if you see ones that are that haven't been labelled as slugs yet, then do get them on there so that Imogen can find them to get them down to species level as well. And jump in, get exploring around your garden and having a look for some mollusks. Thank you very much, Imogen, and we'll see you all again.
Thanks.